what I want.
Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, got a bit of a tabletop gaming video, and particularly this one is going to be more geared towards Tiny D6, but this will really kind of go with any Western setting, may it be Boot Hill or Coyote Trail, so on and so forth. But my intention is to mostly talk about Tiny Gunslingers in itself with this video, and that's because I play Tiny Gunslingers. I have Boot Hill, but I've never played it, and I'm just aware of Coyote Trail, and I can go on and on about the different various Western RPGs out there. But really quick, before I get into today's video, I want to just take a moment, plug my Patreon page. I don't do it all the time, but I do it from time to time to make people aware of it, and that just pretty much to say it's a great way to provide my channel additional support. It helps with a budget, things of that nature. But if you don't want to support on Patreon or can't support through Patreon, another great way to support the channel is liking, commenting, subscribing, things of that nature, sharing the video around, because it does help me as a growing YouTuber, and I do appreciate that kind of stuff. But moving on, today I'm mostly going to be talking about holsters and different types of carry methods in the Old West period. And that's kind of where Tiny Gunslingers comes in. Now, it doesn't really matter. The methods doesn't really matter in the sense of Tiny Gunslingers. There's no special rules or anything of that nature that kind of influences or judges or changes anything. There's no rules about how to carry your characters carry their guns if they carry a cavalry draw versus a cross draw, so on and so forth. But this is just kind of just to throw some history at you, and also maybe get you thinking a little bit when you're designing your characters for your Tiny D6 campaign, may they be NPCs or the player characters themselves. And I'm kind of a man that, well, I like detail, and the devil is in the details. But let's start with probably the most common method, which is the hip method. Well, actually, here's several different methods. Actually, there's two different methods here, technically three, because you have the hip method. There's a cross draw that's on Chris Pratt's character. This is from Magnificent Seven. And then Denzel Washington's character actually has a cavalry draw. I kind of screwed up a little bit there. Don't judge me too hard. I'm old shit. But I'm going to get into, first off, the hip method. This is pretty much the standard hip method, although there is an issue with this photo, which I'll get into a little bit. Just keep in mind Buscadero, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the hip method seems like the most common method out there. It may not be the most common method. I'm not 100% sure. I can only go by what historians say, Western photographs from the Old West, etc., etc. And this does seem to be the most common method. Now, when it comes to the method itself, it's probably going to be more to do, there's probably going to be two major factors. One is going to be comfort, and the other one is probably going to be what your character or what you would have done in the Old West, which is probably why the hip method was such a common method. Now, there is an issue with the hip method, which I'll also get to that here in a little bit. I mean, it's mostly got to do with horse riding more than anything else. But this is one form of hip method. This is kind of the standard where it's on your dominant side. It's right exactly on the side of the hip instead of like in front of the hip or more towards the groin. But then another one I see quite a bit too in photographs, especially probably even more common than directly on the hip, is actually more in the front, towards the groin, but it's still kind of on the hip. And I also commonly see these types of belts where the belt kind of hangs a little low on one side, which is kind of interesting, which kind of will, I'll draw back to the Buscadero thing here in a little bit. But it seems to be a pretty common method to have kind of a lower hanging belt on one side, and then either be directly on the hip or in front of the thigh, if you will. And I would suspect for the people that wear it in front of their thigh, they probably spend a lot of their time on horses, or they just don't find their gun to be very comfortable on the direct side, which I could get into why. And I would argue mostly it's got to do with sitting down in chairs and things of that nature. If your gun is directly on your hip, sometimes like the pistol grip will actually like kind of snag into an arm or something like that as you're sitting down. I'm a gun guy myself, so I know the displeasures of having a gun directly on your hip. So one issue that comes up with having the holster on the hip is because of how you sit on a saddle when it comes to dealing with a horse. And what could end up happening is the gun could actually end up falling out of the holster while you're riding. Now, of course, there's a couple different methods of securing a gun while on a horse. One method, and there's actually two different ways this would be done, would be a horse saddle holster. Now, this is one type of horse saddle holster. This is actually at the rear of the saddle, so this would actually be behind your thigh instead of in front of your legs. So you'd be reaching behind you to grab the pistol. The one issue though I see here though is that buckle. That buckle would be very difficult to deal with in a hurry. So I don't necessarily think this would be a very common method, although this would be a very safe method of having your firearm secured while riding a horse. Now, here's another one I've seen quite a bit online, and I feel this is probably going to be more common. The more common type you're going to see is where essentially think of like a half pistol belt, and it's actually drapes over the saddle horn itself, and then this would actually sit directly in front of you, in front of your thighs. So the pistols here are easy to grab, and there's no buckle or anything. I actually think this is probably the more common method because you could quickly grab your pistol. However, with that being said, all the versions of this type of holster I've seen has more like a cavalry draw to it, which I'll get into more details here in a bit about a cavalry draw. But it does have a bit more of a cavalry draw to it. I couldn't find any photos where actually the handle of the pistol actually faced the rider himself, is what I'm getting at. The pistol butt actually sticks away from the rider and actually faces the head of the horse, so that faces outward. Now, another common method I see, this one's a common method, but definitely not one of the more common methods, is a cross draw. And the cross draw makes a lot of sense to me. Essentially, the pistol is actually on your pistol belt on your non-dominant side, and then when you want to get your pistol, you reach across you with your dominant hand and draw your pistol out. Now, this is a slower method of drawing your handgun. So, for what that's worth, in kind of a quick draw scenario, which was extremely rare actually in the Old West, much more rare than what they show in movies at least. This would actually be a pretty good method to go with. Now, with that being said, this is actually a good method if you're riding horse a lot. And that's because it's got to do with how your legs would be on the horse and things of that nature, and how it would kind of push your holster outward as your thigh would be a little bit up in the air, while you're riding the saddle. And this would actually help prevent the pistol from falling out of the holster, which is one reason to do this method. So I would say for a character or an NPC, whatever, that spends a lot of time on a horse, maybe a cattle wrestler, something along those lines, this would actually be a method that they would probably go with, as it keeps their gun on them, on their gun belt itself, and it keeps it readily available, and they don't have to necessarily worry about their handgun falling out of the holster. Now, this is a picture I took from Red Dead, although I did find historical photographs of people wearing their guns like this. It is not uncommon for people to have multiple handguns on them, particularly lawmen or military personnel, etc. It wasn't incredibly rare. It is definitely more rare in film than in real life, or the real Old West, if you will. But this would be one method that essentially, this is set up in a way where you have a hip draw and then you have a cross draw, and both guns are actually geared towards being drawn by the dominant hand, which is incorrectly depicted in Red Dead Redemption 2, but this is actually a real historical method of how multiple guns could be carried by someone. And like I said, both of these guns are geared towards being a right hand draw. Essentially, the idea is you would draw your hip firearm or your cross draw. You would fire your 6 shots, you'd put that handgun away, and then you'd draw the other handgun. But both would be drawn by the right hand. The idea or concepts of dual pistol fighting, once again, that's more of a Hollywood type of thing, although I do have to admit it does look good in Hollywood. Moving on. And then another method too for carrying multiple handguns would be a pistol on each hip with a belt slung low. And yeah, this is a great method of doing it. This is more of a I want a gun for each hand moment. Um, Not so much like the previous one where both guns were more right hand dominant setup, where this one is pretty much a gun for each hand, which is actually technically what they should have went with for Red Dead Redemption 2. If anyone's ever played it, you'd understand. Now, another way of getting around the issue of your pistol possibly falling out is a flap holster. Flap holsters were quite common, especially with the military. Actually, the flap holster, this is a flap holster. It's a reproduction Civil War flap holster. And even the Confederacy used flap holsters as well. And flap holsters were quite common within the military. Even when the 1911 was put into service, we were still using flap holsters, even for quite a long time after that. Even the Beretta M9 actually had a flap holster for the longest time. So flap holsters are not uncommon at all, especially with military personnel. But even any walk of civilian life could also get their hands on a flap holster for their handguns, and this would help prevent for having issues of riding and your gun just kind of falling out. Now, another method that would also be used particularly a lot by cavalry is actually called the cavalry draw. This was a quite common method. I wouldn't say it was more common than the hip draw, but it was definitely a very common method. And essentially, what you have here is the gun is a little bit more on the left hip, or actually on either hip. Really, I've seen it done on either hip. And essentially, the butt is faced direct forward. Think of like a reverse hip draw, if you will, where the pistol butt is faced forward instead of facing back, but it is still on your hip. Now, there's reasons for this method here, and essentially the idea is supposedly it's more comfortable for riding a horse, but you don't have to worry about your pistol falling out. That kind of seems debatable to me, to be honest. Um, I just think maybe some people might have found this to be a more comfortable method of drawing and carrying their handgun in general. And there's actually a few different pictures out there, Old West pictures of people with their handguns in a cavalry method. Here's actually another one that I have found. And then Red Dead Redemption. I know I'm using Red Dead Redemption here quite a bit, but that's because there's a lot of things he did accurately. But here they show on both Hosea and Micah a dual cavalry draw, and actually another fictional character that did a dual cavalry draw. For those anyone interested, is actually Charlie Prince from the remake of 310 to Yuma. And actually, I did find a video. I will try to remember to put a link in the video description to the original video of how they would be drawn and reholstered. Of course, he's showing a dual method here. And they typically don't show this on in cinema, such as Charlie Prince. They really don't show Charlie Prince actually drawing the guns from the holsters like this. And I think the issue is, and this is my understanding going by people who do like Old West shooting competitions and things of that nature that does this method, is it's a good method, but you got to practice it a lot to make it work. Another common method, especially if it's concealed carry, would be the pocket. And actually, they even made pocket style holsters. So you could actually just put your gun in your pocket. Pockets were actually pretty big at that time period. And they also made specialized holsters actually that you could fit the holster in the pocket itself, and then of course the pistol would go into the holster. And there was even quite a few companies that made different pocket size revolvers at the time. So this was actually a pretty common method, and probably the most common method for concealed carry. Now, another method is the shoulder. Um, the problem with the shoulder method, though, from what I see, is a lot of the holsters that uses the shoulder method, from what I've seen, and pretty much a majority of them that are Old West related, is the holster itself is vertical. So the major limitation here is going to be the size of the gun. Your pocket size revolvers, it's not going to be such a big deal, but your bigger revolvers, it's definitely going to be a big deal. Understand that while a full size revolver nowadays has like a 5-6 inch barrel, at that time the average revolver would probably have a 7.5 to 8 inch barrel. So they were actually, the revolvers in the Old West period were much bigger. Now, of course, when you start getting your cartridge style revolvers, they get a bit smaller, especially like when you start looking at things like the Colt Single Action Army. But the most, at least going by records, the most common style of Single Action Army that was actually sold with a 5.25 inch barrel. So it's still a quite large revolver, especially to carry this way. So you could end up drawing your revolver and smacking yourself in the face. Now, one thing that helped with this would be the invention of the spring clip, which wouldn't be until like the later part of the 1800s. But this is something that would have existed as a shoulder holster in the later periods of the Old West. Now, of course, then you have the Doc Holiday Special, or at least that's what I call it. The issue with this holster, and this is my understanding from various historians who've actually talked about this style holster, is this is a Hollywoodism. That there really is no proof to say that this type of holster actually existed, even though it is a very logical design, because it puts the pistol grip a little bit more forward, and you'd be able to draw actually a longer gun, still wear it comfortably under your shoulder, but have a gun with a longer barrel without smacking yourself in the face. And realistically, I don't see anything here that shouts as something like this couldn't exist. I would actually say it could exist, but there's just no evidence that it did. Now, the Buscadero holster, and I've actually hinted this a few times, This is another Hollywoodism. Um, so essentially, what you have is the belt is either extended or it's got additional leather sewn to the belt or whatever, where it's got a slit so you can run a holster through it. What it does is it allows your holster to hang a little lower. So essentially, you could wear your belt like you normally would instead of having it slouch a little bit on the one side. And you would still actually have your handgun in a very comfortable position for drawing, especially because it'd be right there at your wrist. It's actually a very ergonomic way of drawing a handgun. I even wear something similar myself when I run around with my hand, do things with my handguns. I like my handguns to hang a little bit lower, but I also want my belt to be in the proper belt position. So a good way of getting around that would be something like a Buscadero holster. Of course, now there's tactical drop leg holsters and things of that nature too, which didn't exist at that time. But this is one way of doing it, and this is particularly a Hollywoodism. The thing I have to say about this holster, though, is or this belt setup is it's a cool looking belt setup, and it's definitely something that could have existed at the time. So, I mean, if you're designing your tiny D6 character or your tiny Gunslingers character, and you design it with a Buscadero, I don't personally, I wouldn't see an issue with that as a game master, but some people might. I would argue it's going to be based on how authentic your game master wants to be with his game setting. But I think a Buscadero is a very great way of carrying a gun. And interestingly enough, for how detailed Red Dead Redemption 2 was, here's actually a picture of Dutch Vanderlyn with a Buscadero belt. And like I said a bit ago, it wouldn't have existed. So it's actually really interesting that it made its way into Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, the last thing I want to cover that I think is a Hollywoodism is actually the spring sleeve. Um, it has made an appearance in a few westerns over the years, and I haven't been able to find anything that suggests this even existed in the Old West period, and it seems like it is directly a Hollywoodism. And I've seen arguments explain why it's only a Hollywoodism, and essentially it comes down to is, well, it's very complex and it would be unreliable at the time. It would also be very expensive. So even if it did exist, very few people would have actually been able to afford to even buy one of these or would have the want to buy one of these. And in all honesty, with everything being said and done, it would just be easier to carry a Derringer in your pocket because essentially that's all that these things could have on them is a Derringer. But anyway, folks, I think I will wrap up today's video at that. This went a bit longer than I thought it would have, but hopefully you all enjoyed the video, maybe learned a little bit of something about the ways people would have carried in the Old West period, and maybe think about that when you're designing your different characters and NPCs for Tiny Gunslingers or any other Western RPG for what that matters. Anyway, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.